Next, we'd like to invite Charles Levkoe to the stand. Good morning, Charles.
Good morning.
Can you please tell us your name, qualifications, and where you're from?
Yeah, so my name is Charles Levkoe. I'm Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Food Systems. I live and work in Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada, which is also home to the traditional territory of the Ojibwe, Cree, and Métis people.
So, thank you, Charles. Can you please tell us from your experience what have been the impacts of industrial-scale agriculture in Canada?
Absolutely, yes. So I want to take my time now and focus a little bit on, again, some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities and resistance that has been happening in Canada. I think there's a lot we could learn from Canada, from Australia, and other countries around the world. Okay, so just to set a quick bit of context, this is a map of Canada. It's obviously a big country, second largest country in the world. Highly urbanized, over 80% of the people living kind of on the southern border, down by the US. Also, Canada, one of the largest exporters, agricultural exporters in the world, very industrialized food system. Indigenous people have also inhabited Canada, the land, which we now call Canada, for many, many centuries prior to European settlement. And this included not just permanent settlements, but also agriculture, complex social hierarchies, and trading networks. So notwithstanding many of some successes of the food system today, the food system is increasingly identified, as Eric Holtemedes mentioned, as a contributor to many, many serious problems. And key here, as was mentioned, is that there is more than enough food to feed the world's population, which means the problems are not one of scarcity. And I think, just to, again, repeat what has already been said, we need to consider the ways that power permeates the food system, the ways that social, ecological, and economic inequity impacts who gets to eat, who does not get to eat, who's overfed, who's underfed, who gets compensated for selling, producing food, and harvesting food, and also at whose expense. And we know that inequity is both an impact of the dominant food system, but also a way to reinforce the existing food system. So let me just give you a few very quick examples. As was mentioned, hunger. Canada, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, over 4 million people, 1 in 8 households are living with food insecurity, not enough food, not enough healthy food. You can see in the north, primarily Indigenous, food insecurity is as high as 50%. We know that poverty, as was mentioned, is mostly what is the result, what causes food security. As household income goes down, food insecurity goes up. But we also know that many structural forces in the food system lead to food insecurity, such as low wages, inadequate social assistance, climate change, and for Indigenous people, colonization, land dispossession, loss of autonomy and self-determination, and what has been termed a nutritional transition. And we know that also food insecurity has become chronic, is no longer a temporary thing. Also, food system contributions to climate change. This report from Grain a few years back, an international think tank, identified that between 44 and 57% of the industrial food system, greenhouse gas emissions is a direct result of the industrial food system. This map or graph by an organization called Oxfam, done every few years. We know that about 10 corporations manufacture the majority of what we purchase in the market in Canada. 3 corporations control about 78% of our consumer market. And the challenge here is that there is increasing corporate concentration, leaves very little space and power for democracy, for people to have a say, people to have an active role in the food system. Decision-making tends to be relegated to market processes where people have become alienated from the production, harvesting, and consumption of their food. But there's, in response, many groups, many organizations, Indigenous groups, people's movements have been increasingly coming together to voice opposition to this industrial food system, industrial agriculture. It's led to a proliferation of social action through many alternative food initiatives. Prior to the 1970s in Canada, much of this work was segmented into various sectors, primarily because it's a big country, very different languages spoken, not much technology. But today we're seeing increasing collaboration among these networks, something I've been studying for the last 2 decades. Collectively, these networks have been called a food movement. I've been referring to these as a movement of movements, what has been called unity in diversity coming together. For many food movements, food has become an organizing principle that challenges existing power structures while also working towards, again, more healthy, ecologically sustainable systems. And many of these movements recognize that planetary and social problems are interconnected. They seek to transform our relationships with each other and with the natural world. So I want to just share four areas that I think are very promising examples of where we're seeing more and more opportunity for, again, a transformation of this industrial agriculture, industrial food system. So first, the idea of collaborative approaches. In his latest book, this sociologist Michael Carolon, book called No One Eats Alone, has argued that all of us are affected by other people through our vast food system, and we can no longer afford to ignore these human connections as we struggle with the dire problems like poverty, hunger, diet-related disease, toxic pesticides, depressed rural economies, low-wage labor. And I think in my work, I've seen more and more that change begins with individuals, but has to include a sensitivity to difference and identification of common interests through collective benefits. Building community is key to healthy, equitable, and sustainable food systems, and this involves moving beyond individual market-based approaches, such as vote with your dollar, towards ones that are embedded within meaningful cultural community relations, while improving, again, the idea of good, healthy food for everybody. So food can be, in this way, a deeper point of entry for political engagement. The example on the bottom, Food Secure Canada, a pan-Canadian network in Canada that brings together grassroots organizations, Indigenous people, movements from all over the country to have democratic debate around food policy and to build networks to advocate for broader systems change. The second area I see a lot of hope and promise in Canada is the idea of agroecology. For those who have heard the term food sovereignty, calling for the recognition of the right of people everywhere to define their own food systems and have more culturally appropriate food, more democracy in the food system. In farmers' fields, oceans, freshwater lakes, the global movement of food sovereignty uses agroecology, the science, practice, and movement around sustainable food systems. Agroecology blends scientific practice with the wisdom and ingenuity of farmers, Indigenous people, traditional knowledge, and peasant communities. It aims to support local economies while also increasing biodiversity, resilience, sustainability, and social justice, really focusing on the unique conditions of place. The example on the right, Bauda Family Initiative for Canadian Seed Security, is a farmer-led movement of farmer-led research, what has been called campesino a campesino, or farmer-to-farmer movement, where farmers are growing seed, growing heritage seed, adapting it to the local context, using ecological methods. And as a result, very much challenging global corporations like Monsanto and the control of seed. The third area, I think there's a lot of excitement right now and hope, is in partnerships between settler and Indigenous people. We cannot think about food or water without thinking about the land we're on, and in many cases, the stolen land. When Europeans came to what is now referred to as North America in the 16th century, Indigenous people were systematically uprooted from their homes through war, forced relocation, violence, and pushed into remote areas where they would not get in the way of colonialism and capitalism. Indigenous food sovereignty, however, is a growing movement that uses food as a tool for self-determination and resurgence, and involves a sacred responsibility to maintain relationships with land, plants, and animals, and the ability to determine and make decisions outside of the corporate industrial food system. The example I just want to share with you very briefly, in Thunder Bay, Ontario, we have what I think is one of the first Indigenous food policy councils, an organization, a coalition of 22 Indigenous-led or Indigenous-serving organizations that address food issues and are coming together not just to share their challenges, but find real solutions and to lead the way for other groups in the region to think about how to address food system challenges. Finally, and I'll end with this, many food movements, I think, are seizing the opportunity to advocate for greater power and influence in food system governance. So moving from their place-based and bringing that experience, place-based initiatives, into dealing with more policy, more governance, the rules, relationships, practices, and structures which hold power and control how decisions are made within the food system. So the final example I'll give you on the left here, in 2008, between 2008 and 2011, Canadians went through a process called the People's Food Policy Project. We engaged 3,500 people across the country in what we called kitchen table talks, grassroots discussions, to develop essentially a platform based on food sovereignty to address policy. It was remarkable not only for the number of people involved, but because it effectively introduced concepts of food sovereignty and power in the food system to Canadians. It walked the talk through processes of participation and reflected food sovereignty principles in respect to inclusion of ordinary people, traditional knowledge, and the natural world. And this project has had a profound impact and effect well beyond the food movement, inspiring discussion for food policy and food governance among the general public. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Does the panel have any questions?
Gil? Oh, sorry. Could I, we were talking about a soft revolution or a revolution before. This sounds a bit like it, you know, on the individual group level. But I was wondering about, I don't know, the idea of, in China, for example, it's state, what do you call it, a civilizational state, you know, and democracy didn't help with lifting hundreds and hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. They just decided to do it and do it, you know. And it wouldn't have happened with democracy, not at all, because too many powerful vested interests, say, and so on. Is there any hope, do you think, for anything like that to happen in the West? Because it's, you know, it seems to me that it goes straight to the nub of the matter, you know, straight to it. There's, you know, so many people in poverty, at least in a big country, one big country, and they just simply do it, you know, knowing that they kind of turned a blind eye to the environment, but now they're looking at the environment. So it's a state, you know, a particular state that takes care of that. Do you think the whole structure would have to change in the West? Probably, eh? What do you reckon?
Yeah, so that's a great question, big question. Let me answer it like just in this way. I've been very interested when looking at Canadian food movements and American movements and movements being here in Australia as what I've been thinking of as a prefigurative politics, right? So thinking about ways to not only engage with the state, I think we have to engage with the state if we want to transform the system, especially in democratic countries where we have the ability to speak freely and work with the state. But change does not come from government. We know that. Throughout history, we can look at every major change in society, and we know that it has come through social movements, through grassroots action. So while also engaging with the state, I think we also need to be actively building initiatives, building relationships, building partnerships, which is where a lot of these movements are focused. And you know, we were speaking earlier about this idea. Doing some of my research, someone once talked about it as a nut. When you crack a nut, we need to really put pressure on it from both ends. You can't crack a nut one way. So thinking about working with the state and being engaged with the state at a policy and governance level, but also the grassroots is vital in terms of actually transforming the system.
Good, thank you. Ross?
Thanks, Charles. Charles, I noticed with your map, there's some areas there not applicable, and I noticed the location of those non-applicabilities, which I find geographically interesting, around food insecurity. But the question I've got for you is, what are the threats that you see around food insecurity right now in Canada? What are the major threats?
As we talked about, I think food insecurity, so not having enough safe, acceptable, culturally appropriate, ecologically produced food is primarily a result of poverty. People not being able to afford the food that is available. So people who have money, there's lots of opportunities, lots of choice, or perceived choice at least in a grocery store, but we know that people who don't have money don't have food. But as I mentioned, I'll just repeat this again, I think especially when we look at places in the north, it is more than just poverty. Poverty is absolutely the core, but it is the way that societies have been structured, the way the industrial capitalist food system has taken over, in many ways it has become the dominant food system, not just in Canada, but everywhere. When traditionally and historically, people in the north, in the global north, or in northern Canada, they had access to their hunting grounds, their fishing grounds, they traded, they had agriculture in some cases, but through colonization, again, through this violent dispossession from land, through removal of sovereignty, people have been pushed onto small reserves. Through residential schools, through virtually a genocidal process, have lost their traditional knowledge and their ability to get food in ways that are essentially in ways that work with the environment and give them enough healthy food. So becoming reliant on an industrial food system is essentially, and all the low wages and lower social security and austerity measures that come with it that create poverty is what results in food insecurity, which is a symptom of a much bigger problem, as we've been talking about.
Thanks, James.
And I don't have a question so much as can we just clarify again or restate that that excellent mind map shows 10 corporations control food systems, man-made food-like substances around the whole globe. I just want to sit with that for a moment. I actually thought it was more, 10 corporations. So challenging corporate power has always been part of the agenda of Earth democracy, but it's particularly obvious in these large capitalist food systems. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.